The quality of wine and the distinction of wine in Napa Valley has never been higher. And yet the market has never been softer. What does that mean for how we're going to connect with consumers? What does that mean for a sense of value? Why should somebody buy a bottle of our wine today?
Welcome to Uncorking What's Next. I'm your host, Jeff Zacharia. I've spent 40 years in the wine world, and right now may be the most exciting time to be in it. For 4 decades, I led Zacky's, one of the most trusted names in the wine business. Along the way, I met winemakers, collectors, and thinkers who changed how I see this world. Because wine has always been more than what's in the glass. It's about connection, curiosity, and the stories we share. I'm really enjoying uncorking its future together with you. My guest today grew up far from vineyards, on a dairy farm in the Midwest, with wine barely in the picture. He went from the Air Force Academy to serving overseas in counterintelligence, then on to Harvard Business School, where a single wine tasting quietly changed everything. From Harvard, he walked away from the expected path, moved to Napa without a job, knocked on doors just to learn the business. What followed wasn't a straight line. It was mentorship, risk, and eventually he stepped into a struggling brand with bad credit, no land, and slowly, vintage by vintage, rebuilt it into one of the most coveted names in American wine. Today, Realm Cellars is one of the most dynamic and sought-after wines in Napa. But the journey there was anything but easy. Rebuilding from the ground up, redefining the vision, and quite literally building the plane while flying it. I was so excited to sit down with Scott Becker and talk about that journey and what it really takes to build something meaningful in wine. Follow along. I think you'll enjoy where this goes. Today's episode is brought to you by La Tête d'Or, the French-American steakhouse from legendary chef Daniel Boulud in Manhattan's Flatiron District, serving one of the best lunches in New York. I had the pleasure of working with Chef Boulud over the years, hosting wine auctions together at Restaurant Daniel and dining at many of his amazing restaurants. I've never been disappointed. So I was very excited to see what he's created at La Tête d'Or. It brings together the spirit of classic American steakhouse with refined French flair. Great steaks, incredible seafood, and a fantastic wine list. If you're in New York and looking for a memorable lunch, La Tête d'Or is absolutely worth a visit. It gets my highest recommendation. I'm thrilled to have Scott Becker on the show.
Thanks, Jeff. Pleasure to be here with you.
Before we get into Realm, I'd love to understand a little bit about the person behind the property. Where did you actually grow up?
So I grew up in the Midwest. My family still has a dairy farm in Wisconsin, but I was actually born in Chicago, suburbs of Chicago, and moved around a little bit, Michigan, Indiana, went to high school in northern Indiana, but Wisconsin has always been sort of home for the rest of the family, and fond memories of as a kid sitting on my grandfather's lap or picking stones in the spring in the fields.
Love it.
So that's kind of, but as a kid, you want to get as far away from that as at least I thought I wanted to get as far away from that as I could. So I had to leave come college.
But you came back to it. Clearly farming was in your blood. And did both your parents work outside the home?
Both of them actually grew up on dairy farms. And so, both sets of grandparents were farmers. And that was sort of an era where I think both my grandparents said to my parents, you're going to go get an education and you're not going to work on the farm. And so my parents met at University of Wisconsin. My dad was an engineer. My mom was a teacher.
Such an American story, right? This
totally.
is so, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
My grandfather on my mom's side, I don't think he finished 8th grade, but managing his own farm, eventually saved enough money to buy a piece of property, taught himself how to read the Wall Street Journal and understand commodity prices, etc. But he was adamant his 3 daughters were going to all go get an education and they were not going to go work on a farm. And so for my mom, education was beat into me too. Like, you're going to go get an education and not only a college degree, you're going to go get a master's doing something.
What a nice arc. Was wine part of your life as you grew up?
No,
not at all.
You can imagine. I mean, I don't want to speak for every dairy farmer in Wisconsin, but Friday fish fries, maybe lining kugels, a spotted cow every now and then. But no, wine was not part of a meal. But as I got older, I think I saw wine through food. My mom was a great cook in the sense that it was very important to be at the supper table together as a family. Nice. And so as I got older, wine, I almost started to see it just as the extension of a meal. And that's kind of how I got into it.
And I love that tradition of supper with the family. We did that as well. And as our kids got older, we introduced wine as part of it. And it's become such a magical and important part of all that experience. So that's great.
Yeah.
Then you went off to the Air Force Academy, right? Where you served for 5 years. And that was certainly must have been a big change in everything. And when you look back to that, was that part of the formation of the arc of where you are today?
Well, it's certainly a big part of who I am and what I learned. It was a pretty significant left turn, I think, for me as a 18-year-old high school senior. But I think, again, growing up in the Midwest, I just had this desire to sort of see a little bit more of the world. I wanted to play football in college, and quite frankly, I wasn't good enough to go play at any of the Big Ten schools, or Notre Dame wasn't calling, knocking down my door. And there was maybe also a little bit of, I looked at the service academies. It was they would pay for school. We weren't in such a position that, I knew I was going to have to pay for my own tuition and pay my own way through college. And so that was a factor. So all of those things led me to start looking at the Air Force Academy. But it was a big discussion because nobody in my family had ever been in the military. And so, there was a lot of, are you sure you want to do this? But it was, it was 1996, 97. So it's peacetime. I could go play football. It's Colorado, it's the Rockies. And I thought I could go see the world. So that seemed like a safe choice at the time. But as you learn later in life, nothing is free.
And nothing's as you predict it will be, right? That's
for sure.
That's just inevitable. So then you went from there to Harvard Business School, right? Which is a very different world from the Air Force Academy. How did the two sit alongside each other? Did they conflict or were they complementary?
Yeah, it was a big sort of change in life. So I graduated from the academy May of 2001, and 9/11, of course, happened shortly thereafter. I initially was commissioned as a civil engineer, but it was pretty clear that what was going to happen after 9/11, I wanted to be a little bit closer to the tip of the spear. So I cross-trained into this counterintelligence career field, and I spent a lot of time overseas traveling. And somewhere along that way, actually, we can get into it, but I'd spent a little time in Italy and Germany just as a stopover. I was not a pilot, but we would just stop there as on the rotator plane between the Middle East or Central Asia and the U.S. And would get into wine a little bit that way. But I was 5 years into the military. It was I wouldn't change it for the world, but I was also kind of ready to do something else.
Yep.
You think about the journey of your life. I may not be in the wine business if it weren't for the Air Force. I may not be in it if I hadn't decided to go to business school, because I had spent that time in the military, and I was fortunate to come back, and I had some classmates and friends that sadly didn't. And so it puts life in perspective. And so I show up at Harvard Business School already with this, like, I'm lucky. I got lucky to come back and be mostly normal so shame on me if I don't find out what my real passion and purpose is in life, and if I don't go pursue that. And so for me, business school was very much not just the education, but also the opportunity to reflect personally on what is it that I wanted to go do. And I already had this kind of growing interest and passion for wine. And it just so happened there was a wine tasting on campus, literally my first week. And maybe we'll get into you meeting Rachel and Sabrina separately. But my first week on campus, there's a wine tasting in the fall, first week of classes, and it was Jack Cakebread was doing a tasting for Cakebread Cellars.
My dad and Jack were good friends.
So, talk about the world is small and the wine world is even smaller.
Yep.
So Jack does this tasting. I go up to him after the tasting and introduce myself. I said, Mr. Cakebread, my name's Scott. I'm really interested in the wine business. And he said, oh, it's a tough business. And I said, well, I have a sense of that. My family has a dairy farm. He said, oh, that's an even tougher business. And so we laughed. And it turns out Jack had been in the Air Force.
Oh.
He served in the Korean War.
Huh.
He fudged his enlistment paperwork to say he was 18 when he was actually only 16 to get in. I mean, so you
do it back in the day.
Yeah, you hear these stories, and
Amazing.
I think about this all the time. If I hadn't gone to that tasting. Jack, so after that tasting, Jack and I stayed in touch. He became a mentor. I interned at Cakebread. I wouldn't be in Napa if it weren't for Jack Cakebread. And so, had I not met him or had I not gone to that tasting, you just think how different life might have been.
I love all the parallels, as you said, because I've interviewed Rachel Anderson, who's now at Harvard Business School, who also was in the Army, a helicopter pilot, and fell in love with wine. It doesn't look like, I know you mentioned you wanted to go in a career of wine, which I'd love. It doesn't look like she's going there, but there's certainly a lot of similarities there. So interesting how that can all work.
Yeah,
right?
Well, she's a lot smarter than me, so she's gonna have job offers.
And then, so you graduated Harvard Business School, you moved to Napa without a clear job or a clear plan. That also takes some courage or maybe commitment to your dream, right? And how did your friends at Harvard react to that, or your Air Force friends?
Well, it wasn't so much my friends at Harvard. The people who were the most concerned was like the career services people.
Because what the hell are you doing?
You're supposed to interview. They keep track of all this stuff. So they're looking at my profile as it gets closer to graduation. They're like, we noticed you haven't signed up for any of these interviews or any of these sessions with some of these other companies. And we're thinking, what are you thinking about doing? And I said, I'm thinking about the wine business. They said, well, wine kind of sounds like a hobby, not a career, Scott. And I said, no, you're right. And they said, well, you were in the military, you played football, maybe you should consider Goldman Sachs as an investment banking analyst program that they really like military people. Or have you thought about consulting? And again, this is 2007-ish, so it's like before the downturn.
Oh yeah.
And so a lot of people going into finance and doing very well at it. And so I said to the career services people, I said, I know, thank you, but I'm not interviewing for those things.
Good for you.
I know where I'm going. And, my dad also was a little bit nervous. He said, Scott, what about, you're from a farming family. There's a lot of good companies in ag, Cargill.
Didn't we teach you anything?
Yeah, exactly. But I don't know. I credit, I think had I not been in the military, maybe I wouldn't have, wouldn't have had I wouldn't even say it's confidence, but I would say almost just the clarity or
conviction.
the conviction and or the recognition that life is short and life is precious. And I had cultivated this interest and passion in wine, and I had to go see it through. I would have been living with regrets if I had gone to take a job somewhere else and then said, but my interest is really, in wine.
So fascinating. You ended up at Harlan, which is as good a finishing school as wine as you can get. But I'm curious what you learned there, not about even making wine, but how to build something at the top level.
After that meeting with Jack Cakebread at HBS, I interned at Cakebread. He put me up in the Vineyard house.
Wine people can be so generous that way. I've so seen that, right? I've heard so many stories.
No, he was such an incredible mentor. So my winter break, spring break, summer break, I was flying out to Napa, and he'd put me up at the Vineyard house, and I'd basically do this unpaid internship. Which, if I had to do it all over again, I should have been paying him for what I was, learning from all that. And so when it came time to graduate, for a lot of reasons, it was clear there wasn't going to be a role at Cakebread, and I needed to kind of find my way in the wine business. And so Jack was helpful and tried to introduce me to a few people. I started knocking on doors. The reaction I mostly got was, what are we going to do with a Harvard MBA who doesn't know anything about the wine business? And I look back on it, I'm like, I don't blame those people for saying that. Long story short, I found a couple of guys who'd started an accounting firm, Vic Motto and Mike Fisher. And this is an interesting story about the growth of Napa Valley in just the last 4 or 5 decades. So they moved to Napa and started an accounting firm in the late 70s, early 80s. And as the wine industry evolves and grows, so does their practice. And so from accounting, it becomes consulting and research. And eventually they had this small little M&A piece where they were advising. They knew everybody in town, so they were advising on the sale or purchase of a vineyard or a winery.
And it's a small town, right? It's
very small town.
Especially
and it still is. And it still is. But especially at that time. And so they end up hiring me. And so that was my first job, first paid job, I guess, out of business school. But it was at a unique time because this is 2008, 2009. And so there was private equity starting to come into the wine business a little bit. We got to work on some interesting transactions. And more than anything, I got to meet a lot of other principals and see what did it take to build a successful enterprise, and not just the wine itself, but sort of what are the levers you can pull on in a business to try to make it work. Along the way, Jack used to host this group. He called it the Lunch Bunch, and every so often he'd get all the old timers together, and then he invites me to one of these lunches, and it's Kerner Raumbauer, it's John Schaefer, it's Joe Phelps, it's Michael Mondavi, Bart Araujo, and Bill Harlan, and a bunch of others. And
oh my God.
I show up at the lunch and I'm so intimidated that I say to Jack, hey, I didn't see my name card on a plate at that time. I said, Jack, what can I do? I'm here to help, right? Like
Right.
I'm serving. What do you need me to do? He's like, no, you're sitting. And so he sat me right next to Bill Harlan. And in classic Bill fashion, if you've ever met him, or anybody who has will appreciate this, there's no small talk. So Bill looks straight at me. He says, who are you and what are you doing with your life?
I love
And
it.
that was my introduction to Bill Harlan.
Amazing.
And we started a conversation. I told him what I was doing. He said, this is before Promontory, of course, but he already had this vision and this idea. And he said, well, Scott, you're working on, some of this kind of financial planning transactions. Instead of doing that for others, why don't you come help me do that? And I'm thinking about this idea of a new project. In fall of 2009, I went to work for Bill, and that was the beginning of what became Promontory. And it was such a extraordinary time to be around. The kids weren't in the business yet, but they were thinking about, they were both in college and thinking about what they were going to do. Bill was very much thinking about the generation ahead and what it would take. There was some organizational hesitancy because Harlan and Bond were so successful. Do we really need another project? And so again, I give Bill a lot of credit for forging ahead.
Sticking with his passion, like
Totally.
you're doing. Yep.
And everything I thought I learned in business school, I sort of unlearned working with Bill, but it was its own masterclass in how to think about creating a vision and almost willing something into being. And I feel like I took a lot away from that, but it was also clear by 2011 that Promontory and the whole Harlan domain was going to be very much a decades-long family vision. And I kind of had this entrepreneurial yearning to do my own thing. And so I went to Bill. I said, I think it's time for me to leave. I'm going to go start my own project. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, well, Bill, I'm going to go do what you did. And he said, no, Scott, I would have never started my own project if I would have had the opportunity when I was your age that I'm now giving you.
So interesting.
And I said, Bill, oh my goodness, absolutely. You're crazy. No, no way. You would, first of all, you would have been a terrible employee. He is an entrepreneur. He is the definition of an entrepreneur before his foray into wine and since, right? And so I said, Bill, no. I appreciate what you're saying, but I got to go do my own thing. And so I was going to go start my own project. At that point, I'd made a little wine, kind of like house wine in the 08-09 vintage, just on the side. I'd had a few relationships here or there. I was going to go start a project, and I was looking around in Napa and trying to pick out people who maybe had done something similar, kind of picking their brain, taking them to coffee, buying them lunch. And so I knew the two guys who had started Realm, and I took them to lunch, and I said, hey guys, I'm going to think about starting something kind of a little bit similar to what you did. I'm just curious what the experience has been. And the long and short of it was sort of like, maybe you don't exactly want to model what we've done. And it took a few conversations to figure out why, but then it became clear, okay, they were essentially,
they were struggling.
They were struggling. It was essentially, they couldn't say it this way, but it was essentially bankrupt. So at some point I said, okay, well, maybe instead of me starting from scratch, which I'd have to buy the fruit, it's a few years, as we all know, the working capital that's required, all of that, and said, maybe instead of starting from scratch, I could acquire this business and try to turn it around. And it would give us a bit of a head start. The wines were pretty good. The brand had a following. Juan Mercado, one of the co-founders, had done a great job cultivating some relationships. And so there were the pieces were there, but we just hadn't they hadn't figured out how to make it sustainable.
And what I love about Realm now is it's one of the most dynamic properties in Napa, right? And it's not just the quality of the wine, which is at a very high level, but it's the story behind it that we're getting into. It's not a winery that's been passed down from generation to generation. It's something that's been built, challenged, rebuilt. In some ways, I feel that you've been flying the airplane as you've been building it. And to me, that's what makes it so interesting.
I'm glad you say it's been interesting. I say that exact expression. How do you fix the plane or build the plane mid-flight? At times, it's also frantic and
Of course.
all of that.
But you're seeing it on the inside. I'm just watching it on the outside, right?
Yeah.
Believe me, with Zacky's, or setting up my podcast, plenty of trips up and challenges that hopefully people won't see and all that, right?
Right.
But I love the evolution, right, that I've seen in Realm. And it's in a region that's often defined by tradition and reputation, right? To me, Realm feels very much like you're shaping what's next. And so I'm excited to uncork that story with you here, which we're already starting to do. You acquired it in 2012, right? And as you said, it was in a lot of trouble. What gave you the confidence that this was a smart purchase?
Bill said to me one time, Scott, if we only do the things that are rational, we won't accomplish very much in life. And so I
Fair
think
enough.
that was probably somewhere in my mind. But I think, no, it was this idea of the pieces were there. I loved the name, this notion of, and it's still very true today, this notion of the realm of possibility, that it might just barely be within the realm of possibility that you could start something in Napa in the 2000s or 2010s and try to turn it into one of the iconic domains of the next generation. And I do think that Napa Valley is becoming more, this won't maybe make sense at first, but more Bordeaux-like. I don't mean the wines or I mean more established, more mature.
Yep, some of the business structures.
So it will get harder to start something from scratch in Napa Valley in the decades ahead. And it's something that we very much need to contend with and be mindful of, because I like that dynamism and the entrepreneurial spirit that comes from it. But I feel like I got lucky that I got to be mentored by the Jack Cakebreads. And if you put him into that era of the 60s and 70s and those pioneers, pick whatever name you want, the John Schaefer's, the Jim Barrett's, all those families, the Davies, the Mondavis, et cetera. And they were very much pioneering. This was cow pasture. I would hear stories about people playing catch with a baseball on Highway 29 because there was no traffic, right? That's how little traffic there was.
Yeah.
It's cow pasture and Christmas trees and maybe some walnuts. That was very much this pioneering era. To me, it's not an accident that plus or minus 1990, a few years before or a few years after, the so-called cults all got started around that same time. And it was people, and there's exceptions. Jeannie Phillips at Screaming Eagle is a little bit different than this, but Bill Harlan, Bart Araujo, Gustav Dallavalle, all these people that were coming, Ann Colgan, Joe Wender, Fred Schrader. It was a different era that elevated farming and small production, and land, of course, along the way started getting more and more expensive. And by the time I arrive in the mid 2000s, it's pretty clear that Napa Valley is a world-class place for growing Cabernet. The land is expensive. And so to me, the way to get started was clearly through this virtual model. And we weren't alone in this, but I liked that. It's funny because now owning some land, like I started thinking I don't need to own the land. I can just buy fruit. I can rent space in somebody else's facility and try to build a following and build a brand. And it was a somewhat capital light way of doing it. Me stepping into this, I thought, okay, there's some liabilities here. Part of the purchase price was simply me assuming those liabilities.
Including, right, the issue in 2009 with the Bard?
Yeah, well, I didn't find that out until we closed the purchase. But I don't mind saying it now. We can look back on it. We owed Andy Beckstoffer $1 million in 2012. We hadn't paid for our 11 fruit, our 2010 fruit, and a part of our 9. Right. And so before I bought the business, I sat down with Andy Beckstoffer. I said, I know what Realm owes you, and I'm prepared to assume that note. I'm going to need some time to kind of pay you off over time, but please don't sell the fruit to somebody else, because he told me if we didn't close the deal by July 31st, he was selling the fruit to somebody else. And we closed on July 11th. So it was, just in the nick of time. But so I saw this as like, I could assume these liabilities. That was part of the purchase price. The name Realm, this idea of entrepreneurial, and it might be a possibility to try to build something. As I said, Juan had done a really nice job cultivating some relationships as the face of the brand. Benoit Toquette, Juan and Benoit had been roommates. I had known Benoit from being around in the Valley. He was incredibly talented. And I think he was also at that moment in his career looking for something to sink his teeth into. And so it was essentially Juan, Benoit, and I sitting down and saying, okay, do we think we can turn this into something? I look at it as the refounding or founding of Realm 2.0 started in 2012, because other than the name Realm, we took everything and had to strip it all the way back down to the base. We had to change the name of the entity because our credit was so bad in town. Right. Nobody, we had to put cash up front to get things. We changed the labels, we changed the winemaking, we changed everything else about it to try to orient it towards this vision of what we wanted it to become.
And was there a moment where you thought you wouldn't survive in those early years?
It's too many to count. I would say it was almost naivete.
Yeah.
But this is why I go back to like the brilliance of what Bill told me. Because part of me says, if I knew then if I knew what it would take, I'm not sure I would have done it.
Yeah.
Because I look back and I think, gosh, how lucky we were. The ball had to bounce our way a couple of times. It happened to be the couple of good vintages, 12 and 13. There was a tailwind. We're coming out of the post Great Recession, so people are spending money again. Napa was going through this tailwind that we sit here now in the 2020s, and we can look back and say, wow, the 2010s was a very different era for wine consumption than what we've seen so far in the 2020s. And so all these things had to kind of converge, and I didn't appreciate any of that in that moment. It was much more about, I think I have something I want to say, or a point of view in the wines that I want to make in Napa Valley. And I've been fortunate to have these mentors, the Jack Cakebreads and the Jim Barretts and the Bill Harlans. Bart Araujo is still a big mentor to me. But I think we can say something or do something a little bit distinct from that. And how are we going to contribute to the arc of Napa Valley wine growing?
And when you arrived at Realm, you were, as you said, you were basically a grape buying operation with no estates and no land. But now land ownership, I think, is at the foundation of everything you've done. And why is that so important for you now?
Yeah, that's been a huge transformation for us.
Yeah.
And so I think the turnaround in the brand or in the business was like 2012 and 13. We'd started to see some momentum and some pull, and financially, it was going to sort of, pencil out by 14, 15. Think about this, back in the era where Robert Parker moved the markets. Our 2011 vintage, he gave the wines 87, 88 points, which in the world of high-end Napa Valley, that's like,
it's like
not really a passing grade.
No.
The calendar years of 13 and 14, we don't have the 12 vintage in bottle yet or sold. And so we're selling through old inventory. You mentioned the 09 Bard. I discover after the purchase that 09 Bard had a Brettanomyces issue.
Oh my God, that must be awful.
Still painful. But you look back and you realize those are the defining moments. And so we committed to ourselves then. I was like, some bottles had already been sold, but most hadn't. And I said, we cannot sell this. This does not reflect, our style of wine. Not to say that there aren't plenty of other wines around the world that benefit from a little bit of Brett, but for us, that wasn't the expression we wanted to have. And so we decided to dump it all down the drain.
Hi, listeners. Sorry to interrupt, but I've been asking for feedback on the show. And one of the comments was that sometimes we talk about something that's obvious to those who are deeply entrenched in the world of wine, but not to everyone else. You just heard Scott mention Brett. Here's what Brett means. Brettanomyces, or Brett, is wild yeast that can take hold in a winery and make its way into the wine. At low levels, some winemakers and drinkers actually find it adds complexity, a kind of earthy, spicy note. But when it gets out of control, it produces what Scott described perfectly, barnyard. Every affected bottle is different, which makes it especially hard to manage. Scott made the call to dump the entire 2009 Bard rather than let it define Realm. That decision says everything about where this winery was headed. So what did you do with the wine that had been sold?
The bottles we hadn't sold, we pulled the cork on every single one by hand and dumped it down the drain as a little bit of like a painful exercise for ourselves.
Yes.
And every bottle we said, I swear we're never going to do this. This won't happen again. The bottles that had already been sold, I had this debate with myself. We really couldn't afford to buy them all back. And so do I say anything? Do I not? At that time, we chose not to say anything. If somebody called us, we certainly refunded them the bottles. If I had tried to go buy all those bottles back, it would have been a few $100,000 that we just didn't have at that time. To this day, it's funny you ask, because we just had a customer who visited us, a member who's been with us a long time, who came to visit a few weeks ago, and he said, "Oh, I've got these bottles of '09 Bard. I bought 5 back in the day. I drank one and it was awful. And so I didn't open the other 4. And so we told him, hey, please, we'll buy those back from you. Happy to have them back." And the thing about Brett, not to go down this rabbit hole, but like, the bloom in the bottle is different. Every bottle was different. So you could open one bottle and it wouldn't really present itself. And you could open another and it was flat out barnyard. And so it was really hard to know, but it was clear we couldn't move through the rest of the inventory. And so I think it was 250 cases, something like that.
Oh my God.
It was a pretty significant amount of inventory that we ended up.
It's hard.
At a business that was only making 1,000 cases, that was a quarter of our production.
Right.
You got to try to get those things right to define who you want to be. And eventually, maybe the customer or the market would figure that out. Plenty of difficult moments in those early years, but by 2014, the release of the 12 vintage, Mr. Parker decided to give us some really big scores. Benoit and I still debate this because I say we got lucky, and he says yes, but everybody had the same vintage to work with.
I think you make your own luck. That's my philosophy these days. You make your own luck.
I think Benoit would agree with you, and
okay,
but he gave us and I think this was the tail end of his career. And I think he looked at it and obviously liked the wines that he was tasting. But more than anything, I almost think he was trying to send us a signal, like, I'm going to give these guys a chance. I actually wrote him a letter to this effect afterwards when he retired. Hey, I'm not sure that at that time, as this scrappy little startup making wine at somebody else's facility, contending with a Brett issue from a few vintages before, 12, Mother Nature comes around, blesses us. It's a pretty ripe vintage. The wines are luscious and big and expressive. And he liked those wines. And I said to Mr. Parker, I don't know that we deserved it from where we sat as this fledgling little startup, but you gave us a chance. And I think every day since we've been trying to live up to that. And I think that this evolution from virtual to owning a piece of land was a big part of that. That if we, in the long run, if the goal was to produce wines of distinction and that would stand among the very best of Cabernet Sauvignon from around the world, that we needed to own the land to be able to do that. We needed to take that next step.
And you bought, I think, Moonracer first, right? And Pictured Hill. I don't quite remember all the details. But was there a master plan for buying these vineyards, or was it opportunistic?
I would love to sit here and pontificate about the master plan, but
yes, I know the feeling.
no, I can't say that. It was very much. I will tell you the common theme between the three vineyards that we now consider part of the estate program. It comes down to relationships. And so, in the case of where the vineyard, the hillside behind me here,
which one is that?
I'm at Moonracer here.
Moonracer. Okay, great.
In the Stag's Leap district. This was the old Hartwell estate. Mm-hmm. And Benoit had made wine for the Hartwell family prior to joining Realm. And so he had a relationship with Bob Hartwell that I think was incredibly instrumental in allowing us to be able to buy this property. By the time late 14, early 15, Bob was getting older. His health was failing him a little bit. And he was thinking about, what do I need to do to set this up for my family? His kids didn't want to continue it. Benoit and I convinced him that we could be the natural stewards of this property. And it was clear, though, that that was going to require a bigger check than I or the business could write by myself. So we went out and raised capital from a group of individuals, people who've been mentors and supporters to me, and who ultimately were buying into the vision of what we were trying to build. And so it was this process of working through trying to raise capital from investors, but also the bank. How much would the bank let us borrow? And then convincing Bob Hartwell that we could actually close it. Because I remember my first meeting with Bob, he said, well, if you don't, it's clear you don't have the money yourself. So, how do I know you're going to, I said, Bob, I'm going to find ways to show you our word is good and that we will earn your trust and the right to be the stewards of this property and try to build on what you started. And so amazing. We went through that process in 2015. We closed at the end of 2015, December 30th, 2015. And that was, I think, probably, if I look back, maybe the biggest moment for Realm was that arc or that transformation from just buying fruit to owning land, because there's something that fundamentally changes in you. Literally, my entire being and way of thinking, I think, has changed as a result of owning land. So that's been a big part of the journey. And it's been 10 years, essentially. 16 would have been the first vintage, farming our own hillside behind us and having our own facility. And so here we sit a decade later, and I realize now that we've still got another few decades to go before the vision is actually realized. So,
You look at the history in Europe of wine, right, of Bordeaux, where they've been making wines for centuries, and there's just it takes a long time to really understand your land and to really bring it to perfection, right?
Totally.
But along with the wine, the vineyards that you own, you're still buying grapes from Beckstoffer to Kalon and Dr. Crane, which is, I think, also an important part. But to me, Tokalon is one of those mythical vineyards. What do you feel when you walk through those vineyards?
Tokalon, as you said, there's a feeling of reverence, of history, context that even goes all the way back to the 1800s.
I think, yeah.
Exactly. And I think I think you mentioned you've had Graham and Alex on.
Yeah.
So, there
really
is no
interesting story as well.
There is no greater historian for Tokalon than Graham and Alex McDonald.
And they're trying to make it an AVV, I think, right? Are you following that?
Yeah. No, look, I think there's this whole debate over, trademarks versus the value of a place. And it's very clear if you're into wine, like the importance of place is everything. I think in the long run, somehow, some way they will prevail, I think, in that effort. And Tokalon is just a special place. And so is Dr. Crane. There's a history there going back into the 1800s with George Belden Crane, was a physician out of San Francisco and really pioneered viticulture in Napa Valley at that time, the 1860s, 1870s. And so, I think Andy Beckstoffer did an incredible job amassing these heritage sites. And to me, what's so incredible is he was buying that land at a time that Hubline wanted out of owning land so bad that because I asked Andy once how could he, this was at a time when I was trying to figure out how to raise capital to buy our first piece of property. I said, well, Andy, how did you do it? And he said, well, Scott, I did it the way anybody does it. He said, I borrowed as much as I could. And I remembered that. But, he also told me, I think Hubline gave him 100% seller financing.
Wow.
To buy those vineyards.
Nice.
And that's how bad they wanted out of land. And if you think about how different we think today, just a few decades later, that land is everything, that there isn't more of it really to be planted in Napa Valley. And so that's what I mean by maturing and becoming a little bit more like Bordeaux. Like it's planted out. I mean, there will be a few acres here or there, but it's largely planted out. And over decades, we're starting to tease out what is the character of some of these sites. Obviously in the US, we'll never agree to some sort of a classification system that you have in Burgundy of Grand Cru, Premier Cru, et cetera. But I think the market and the consumer and winemakers will figure that out over time. Which sites are truly great, which ones are excellent, very good, and which ones are, village.
And what's new and exciting, which is also important as well, which is like Farella to me, is certainly not nearly as well known to me as the other sites, right?
Yeah.
And so what drew you there?
Well, again, it starts with a relationship. So Frank Farella starts a law firm in San Francisco that's still there, Farella, Braun and Martel, in the 1960s. He becomes Robert Mondavi's personal attorney through the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. Well, along the way, Frank decided he wanted to buy his own piece of property. And so in the late 70s, he acquires this parcel in Coombsville on 3rd Avenue. And Coombsville's southern part of Napa Valley, so it's a little bit cooler there than further north.
Maybe good right now with global warming.
Totally. And so, but at that time, think about this, it's 79, 80, and Robert Mondavi says to him, well, Frank, you got to plant Chardonnay. It's too cold down there for Cabernet. And so Frank decides, but Frank goes ahead and plants some, he planted a little Chardonnay, but he planted some Cabernet as well, convinced his son, Tom, to come back and make wines off the property. And so for many years through the 80s and 90s, the fruit was going to, Tom would make a little bit of wine under the Farella Park label, his son, and then the rest of the fruit would go to Robert Mondavi. Eventually, once the sale of Mondavi to Constellation, et cetera, early 2000s, Frank decided he didn't really want to sell. He wanted to sell fruit to small producers. Along comes the Realms of the world and several others who were buying fruit from that vineyard. Meanwhile, on a parallel path, I moved to Napa Valley. I take this first job and I meet Frank as an attorney. He kind of mentors me a little bit. And later after Harlan, I was leaving and I was buying the Realm business. I had Frank as my attorney. And so Frank said to me, hey, Scott, are you sure you want to buy this brand? Are you sure you want to do this? And so, but he structured
I would have said the same thing.
Yeah. So he structured the documents. And then in end of 15, when we acquired the property from the Hartwells, Frank once again represented us. And I think he saw how we handled the Hartwells and how we were trying to build on what they did. And Frank came to me in 2018 and he said, Scott, would you ever have an interest in my vineyard? And I said, Frank, are you kidding me? I'd be honored. But, I don't know if we're digesting what we've got. I don't know. And he said, well, maybe we could do some sort of a long-term arrangement with the family, some sort of a partnership, a lease, whatever would work, something with the family long-term. And
it's great he had this kind of confidence in you, right? That he just wanted to make a deal with you. Yeah, yeah.
Incredible. And
that
look,
says a lot about you, Scott. That really does.
Thank you for saying that. But I feel a deep responsibility to the Frank Farellas, to the Bob Hartwells, to the Chang family who sold us the property on Pritchard Hill, to try to build on. And this is what I say, when we're standing on the shoulders of giants, we're standing on the work of others. If you're making wine in Napa Valley today, you didn't get there by yourself. All the way back to playing football at the Air Force Academy, our old coach, Fisher DeBerry from South Carolina, he had a Southern drawl and a high-pitched voice, but he would have this line. He would say, men, if you ever see a turtle sitting on a fence post, he didn't get there by himself. And I feel like that's Napa Valley. If you're making wine in Napa Valley today, you're standing on the shoulders or the work of others. Frank was just this incredible mentor. I see Coombsville as, imagine what Oakville, and you'll appreciate this with all the years building Zacky's and what you did for wine in general and Napa Valley in particular. If you think about the way we talked about Oakville in the 1990s, maybe the 80s and the 90s, I wonder if we will be talking about Coombsville in that way in the 2030s and 2040s.
I think that's a very possible scenario. Yeah.
That region is so unique, that it's not just, it's certainly there's the climate factor, but it's more than that. You're starting to see the investment in farming. There's not a lot of wineries there. It's a relatively small place. When you're standing at the Farella Vineyard, you feel like it is a walk back in time. It is peaceful. The only thing you hear is the birds. There's no traffic. There's a rusticity to the place that maybe in some ways comes across in the wines, even the tannins of the wine. There's a little bit more of an earthy, savory character. So I think it's a very distinct expression of Napa Valley, and maybe one that's increasingly going to be important in the years to come.
Yeah. So I have a question about Realm overall. I mean, you have the vineyards you own, you're buying grapes, you work with multiple vineyards across Napa. How do you create a consistent identity without a single estate?
Yeah, like anything at Realm, it's still very much a work in progress.
You're still building the airplane as you fly it, right?
Totally. So there's this tension inherently between, if we're going to make 12 different wines, then they need to each have their own reason for being and their own raison d'etre and an identity and a character. And yet at the same time, to your point, there needs to be some unifying thing. And so we came up with this kind of architecture for the labels that, quite frankly, if you go back in time, we're this struggling brand trying to make payroll and stay afloat. We don't own a winery. We don't have a famous name. Probably the most recognizable thing we had was Beckstoffer Kalon. So we said, well, what are we going to put on the label? And this is where the idea came, was like, well, if we're going to make a couple of different wines, then they should each have their own identity. Why not start to tell the story on the label, the name of the site or the place or the character of the people? And so all the labels for each of the wines are different. But there is a unifying theme, because on every one of them, we sort of laser etch out of the paper on the label the R. And so that R was meant to be the thing that keeps us all together and creates this unifying identity. And of course, it's the realm of Napa Valley. We're not trying to be all things to all people. Over time, people will always ask me, do you want to make a Chardonnay? Of course, I love to drink white Burgundy, but no, Realm, do one thing and do it really, really well. Yep. And so we've tried to keep this focus of these different sites, predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon. Of course, we'll make one white wine because it's compelling to have a Sauvignon Blanc in the mix, but focus on telling the story of Napa Valley through this portfolio of wines, because Napa Valley is not one place. It is this collection of microclimates, mesoclimates that all kind of come together. And so we think of that as that's the portfolio of Realm. So we spend a lot of time from a blending and farming standpoint, talking about how we accentuate the nuances between the wines. And I think we're getting better at that. That's the next decade, more so than the last. But at the same time, somebody ought to be able to taste those wines. And as a consumer, we want them to be like, oh, you had Realm last week? Can you remember which one? I don't remember which one, but they're all good. There's that too. And so there's an inherent tension there. But I think that's where the creativity comes from, is this tension of, You want there to be some consistency to the house style. And at the same time, we want to reflect the unique character of each of the different wines that we make. And so there's no easy answer to that question, but it's something we wrestle with every single day. But I think that's where the magic comes from, is in that tension.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I thought I understood Realm before this interview. And as I really studied it more and got into it, I said, oh, there's like a whole nother level as you're describing that I didn't fully understand. And I'm still trying to learn it, as I'm sure you are as well in some ways, trying to figure it out. In Burgundy, there are great estates that own land, but also buy a lot of grapes, right? But they make a huge range of wines at every different level. I'm not aware of any other fine wine estate out there that's similar to what Realm is doing. Would you agree with that statement?
If that's true, that's an incredibly humbling statement. I got to think about that, if that's actually
Well, it's
true.
humbling if you're really doing something brilliant, which I think you are, but if you're sort of out on the edge, right?
Yeah. No, thank you for saying it, Jeff, because
Yeah.
it's almost hard to explain Realm, because I start by almost explaining what it's not as opposed to what it is. And the best example of this is, maybe it's a little bit different than what you just said, but we're not this corporate entity that is publicly traded or has institutional capital, but we're also not a small family project that has been in the family for decades, et cetera. So we're not this and we're not this. We're not just an estate. We're not just a negociant. We're not the highest, we're not the most expensive wine, but we're certainly not cheap either. And, we spend every day thinking about, we got to make sure we're delivering value.
I think you are well placed, actually, price-wise.
But that makes it hard. And it's if I'm meeting somebody who knows Napa, at least through the lens of some of the iconic names, and they don't know Realm, it's been hard to distill it down to a 30-second thing because of exactly this issue that you're describing. It's almost like we're taking bits and pieces and inspiration from a lot of different places. I love the commercial scale and success of Opus One. I love the mystique that you get, from a Harlan, and certainly what Corey's done from a Vine Master program and where he's taking that is incredible. I love you mentioned Burgundy, the sense of place, the reverence for the land that you get from several of the domains there.
And then you get a Jadot or a Drouin who's similar to what you're doing, but not really.
Totally. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, we're not nearly at that scale. So
right.
So we take inspiration from wherever it may come. It's almost easier as consumers to sort of say, well, we can put this. They're trying to be like this, right? But I think the danger of that is it's a different era now. So I'm not trying to. We don't want to be, Opus One or Joseph Phelps, or any more than we want to be Harlan or Colgan or any of those others. We respect all of them.
Of course.
And we take bits and pieces of inspiration, but we need to be who we are for this era.
You are forging your own path out there, and that's fantastic. Do you think anyone else will follow that model?
Yes, I think I think that there will be. At least I hope so. I think that you're going to see a mix. I mean, I love what Maya's doing at Dalla Valle, as a second generation stepping into her own. And so there's a good example of, I think there will be some successful family transitions. I think you'll see new entrants come in. At least I hope so. But in the end, there's a little bit, of course, we're going through this major reset right now. So we'll see what this means. But I guess I've always thought that in the long run, most of the vineyard land, the let's call it Premier Cru and above in Napa Valley, would be owned by wineries, because ultimately that's where you tell your own story. The margin is in a bottle of wine, not in the grapes. And so that's where I guess I figured in the long run we would see others who would want to make that same leap. If you start, and I'm glad that we started the way we did. I think the danger is you come to Napa, you sold a tech company for 9 figures, and you come to Napa and you hire a consultant and you do everything right, and the wine is really good, but you didn't build a brand yet. And just because you can do those things and the wine is really good does not mean the consumer needs to pull it. And so what we did was starting virtual, I think for a lot of reasons, and we already covered it, we got lucky, but we created a little bit of momentum and a little bit of that like flywheel effect before we bought land. If somebody tries to follow our path, I'd say start small, build the concept, create the momentum and create the brand, and then layer on top, versus starting already with, this vision of building this incredible thing. And you can hire all the right architects and hire all the right consultants, but it may not work.
You got to walk before you run. Totally agree. And then in 2020, you made one of the hardest decisions that a business owner has to make, right? Where you chose, because of the smoke taint, not to make any wine. How did you make that call? And have you had any second guesses about the decision that you made?
Of all the questions you were going to ask me today, this is probably the one I was, the most nervous about. Only because I have a very strong opinion, and it is only that. It's informed by our own personal view. And so if you go back, 2017 was the first fire to hit Napa Valley, but it was October 8th. And so it was later in the season. We had about 2/3 of the fruit in by that point. The fruit that came in after the fires started, we had the opportunity to play with and send to the lab and run some experiments, etc. And so not everybody in 2020 had that experience, because if you were picked out by the time the fires hit in 17, you didn't have the experience with post-fire fruit. So we had some experience, and very much our decision in 2020 was informed by some of the things we'd learned in 17, because it's like, what else are you gonna, we tried to extrapolate some things, and there is some correlation or relation between, what you can measure in the berry versus what ends up in the wine. And and there is I'll say this too, it's like, of course, there's a lot of science behind this, but it is still very much inexact. And that's why people are making judgment calls.
You have to. You just don't know, right? You don't know what it's going to be like in 5 or 10 years.
So we get to 2020, and the first fire hits on August 17th.
Right.
So the first thing I'll say that's probably controversial, and look, I've got a lot of friends and people who I respect who bottled wine and made wine. And so they did what was right for them, and we tried to do what was right for us.
Yep, absolutely.
No, I know, but I'm calibrating myself here, because it's going to sound like I'm judging. No matter how you farm for Cabernet, it's not ripe on August 17th. Even if you prefer the greener side, even if you irrigate less, dry farm, etc., August 17th, it's not ripe. That first fire, August 17th, was, when people say now we pick before the fires, for the most part, they mean the second fire, which hit September 27th. But it was that 6-week window from August 17th onward that was the one that actually was pretty impactful.
Right.
And so, like everybody, you start grabbing samples, you're sending it to the lab. We were fortunate. We got a couple of lab samples back, or lab reports back, early on, before the labs all got jammed up. And then everybody started sending fruit to labs in Australia and France and Canada to try to get some results. And so it was chaos, utter chaos.
Sure, because you're not prepared. Nobody's prepared for this.
No.
It's like when I was talking at Lafleur, when they first in 17, where they got this major frost. Nobody was prepared. Nobody.
No, it was. I blame myself for. After 17, I looked at it not like we didn't know that there was still risk, but it's almost like I wanted myself to believe that was an anomaly.
Yeah.
Whereas after 2020, everybody's way more prepared. There's a lot of investment going in to try to understand how do we mitigate smoke taint, et cetera. But anyways, we get to that Labor Day, early September, and it was already clear by early September of 2020 that we were going to have a problem. And to one degree or another, most, if not all, of the fruit was going to be impacted. And if you go back and you look at the number of days where the air quality index was in the unhealthy range, well over 100 or 150 PMI, there were more days of that between the first and second fire than there were in the second fire beyond. And so there was this one kind of day that was the cataclysmic day in the Bay Area where the sun never came out. Yeah. That all happened in the first. That was the 6-week window before the second fire. And so we brought a few things in. We sent some stuff to the lab. We're making judgment calls. We did some micro ferments just like everybody else. But we also took our data from 17 and started to look at if the berries are already showing this now, then what would that maybe show free? Because there's sort of bound and unbound. We just got to this place of like, Realm, and I go back to the decision we made with 09 Bart. Realm either stands for trying to pursue the very best, or it stands for nothing at all. And it was one of those decisions in those moments. Was it the right call? Look, I don't know. Do I regret it?
You'll never know.
I still lose sleep over this decision. I respect the people who made wine. I've tasted a lot of it. We've sent it all to the lab because that's what we do. I haven't tasted anything yet that convinces me we made the wrong decision, but I realize it was literally the most painful decision that we've made. I mean, you lose a full year's worth of revenue. It was a 5-year impact on the P&L. But at the high end, the whole thing we're after is this sense of purity and sense of place. And so, look, I mean, I've had a lot of off the record conversations with the critics who, I think called out some producers, but not everybody. And here's my worry. I don't think the answer on 2020 will be out until maybe 2030.
Yep.
Because the other thing we know about smoke taint is it evolves and grows in bottle over time. And so let's see how those wines evolve. And I guess I just feel like if Napa Valley is going to charge the prices that we charge for these wines, then we need to hold ourselves to the highest possible standard, because otherwise, why should the consumer be paying hundreds of dollars a bottle?
And there's a reason for the whole AOC system in France, because it keeps the quality up so everyone has confidence in it. And I'm not judging here because I don't know, but if this will really affect the quality of that vintage, it's going to hurt everybody.
I know for a fact, just based on the lab results, that there are some very well-established and very well-respected brands who put stuff in bottle that is to one degree or another compromised.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's this whole, like, if we don't believe it, if we don't have conviction in what we did, then how can we ever expect the consumer to? And I think this doesn't play out in one vintage. It's almost like it plays out over time. That in the long run, your brand and your product kind of like converge, right? They become one and the same. And so I still think that, it was a painful decision. I don't know if it was in the long run, if it was the right decision, but as painful as it was, if I had to do it all over again, knowing what I know today, I wouldn't have done something differently. And I hope that what that means for Realm in terms of who we are, what it means for our team who works here, and the conviction that they can have behind what we're trying to achieve, that in the long run, hopefully it sets us apart. But I say that, and again, it's a hard one because the valley is still, I would say, probably divided on this. You've got the Schaefers and the Realms and maybe the Colgans or the 100 Acres who didn't make wine, and the Harlans and the Screaming Eagles and many others did. And there is certainly some nuance here, and I respect that everybody had to go through that. I worry a little bit about what does that say about the Napa Valley brand if there are a few wines out there that are, hundreds of dollars a bottle and they are marked to one degree or another. That's not the reputation that we want to have. We need to be over delivering, not trying to pull one over on consumers.
And we have to be able to have the conversation, right? It has to just be right. I felt I needed to ask the question because it's an important question to ask. France has issues with premox and Burgundy.
Hi, listeners. One more time. Here I am. Scott and I also touched on premox, premature oxidation. It's a problem most associated with white Burgundy, though it can affect any white wine. Normally, a great white wine evolves slowly over the years in the bottle, anywhere from 10 to 50 to even 75 years. With premox, something goes wrong. Whether it's oxygen getting past the cork, winemaking choices, or storage, and the wine ages too fast. You open what should be a vibrant, youthful bottle and find something flat, nutty, and way past its peak. For Grand Cru Burgundy at $300 to $400 a bottle, that's a heartbreak. As Scott put it, if any other region had this problem as consistently as Burgundy, the press would be relentless. But somehow we've learned to accept it. Should we?
France has issues with premox and Burgundy. You're not the only one struggling with issues, but it's an important conversation to have.
The premox one is interesting because I feel like that I've often said to friends, and I love white Burgundy, but if it was any other region, if any other region had that problem, we would be eviscerated in the press and in the consumers. And for some reason, and I do this too, for some reason as consumers, we go, but that's just the heartbreak of Burgundy. When you get one that's on, it's amazing. And we're going to let it pass that this, Grand Cru domain, whatever 3-4 digit bottle of wine is premox.
I don't know who, but I want to have somebody on the show to discuss premox because I think it's a really important conversation to have.
I'll be watching that one closely.
Hi, listeners. Last interruption, I promise. As I was reviewing this episode, the conversation about premox with Scott got me thinking. This deserves its own episode. Premature oxidation in white Burgundy has been one of the most frustrating and least openly discussed problems for decades. I'd love to dig into it properly. The science, the accountability, what's changed, what hasn't. So I'm asking you, who should I be talking to? A winemaker, a scientist, a critic who's covered it closely. Send me your suggestions at my email or find me on Instagram. Let's uncork this conversation together.
I'll be watching that one closely.
Okay, good. You've talked a lot about craft and culture as your two pillars of Realm, but you've also said you don't want to be a cult winery anymore. What's the distinction here, and what would you like to be called?
When you said we don't want to be a cult winery anymore, from my point of view, what I'd say is I don't think we ever were one or are one, because I think that to me, that there is an era. You know, if this is art or music, we can define it in periods, and there is a cult era, but that era has clearly passed. And to the credit of all those wines who were or are cults that were defined in that era, I think they all recognize that too, and they've taken a lot of steps to make sure that their domains, their brands are relevant for the next generation. It's hard to describe the era we're in. It's almost like we need the historian's lens to be able to describe whatever this era is that we're in now. But it's definitely the post-cult era. And there is this element of next generation. And we say this a lot in terms of our vision. We talk about internally and externally, Realm aspires to be one of the iconic domains of Napa Valley's next generation. And when I say next generation, I mean both for the consumer and the way the consumer is going to engage with wine, as well as for the producer themselves. And so to me, what we wanted to be marked by is this, and I think hopefully this is what resonates with the next generation of consumers. And I don't necessarily even just mean age. I just mean the way people are interacting with wine today is this notion of craft and culture. And by craft, I mean working on the 1%, finding 100 different ways to make 1% improvements in the vineyard or in the cellar. And craft also applies, how do we treat our customer? What is the customer service? What does our hospitality look like? How tight are our numbers? All that is craft. And then this culture piece, to me, is increasingly important because the caliber for wine in Napa Valley is so high. And it's to the credit of everybody else who's obviously been here long before me and the ones who are here making wine today. Like, you have to have something more that defines you, that defines the brand. And so I think this culture piece is really important. And who we are internally is, in the long run, who our customer is going to perceive us to be externally. And so those two things need to be 100% aligned. And even if they're a little bit off, over time, you start to feel that. The quality of wine in Napa Valley has never been higher, I think. And by quality, I mean even like the distinction. And I love that you can drink Steve Mathiasen and Kathy Corazin's wines on one end of the spectrum, and they're beautiful. And you can drink, Jason Woodbridge's wines and Russell Bevan wines that are much, more hedonistic on the other end of the spectrum. And there's everything in between.
Yep.
I love that. And so the quality of wine and the distinction of wine in Napa Valley has never been higher. And yet the market has never been softer.
That's the whole wine market overall is softer, right? That's not a Napa Valley issue.
That is true. But I do think part of it that we in Napa Valley would be remiss if we didn't take this moment to say, so what does that mean for the future?
Absolutely.
And so what does that mean for how we're going to connect with consumers? What does that mean for a sense of value? Why should somebody buy a bottle of our wine today? And I think that's why I say this is a post-cult era, is we need to wrestle with our own identity and maybe get, and again, I'm just one producer here, but the Napa Valley that I fell in love with, I could see how a cynical consumer today would say that they have a different view. It's the elitist, it's expensive, they're out of touch, the wines all taste the same. I think that part, the last one, is unfair, but we've got to get back to, the authenticity of this place. And totally. It comes in the wines themselves and in the people.
Yes.
And so I think that's why, to me, with the team emphasizing craft and culture, hopefully it translates to our consumers, and they feel like they're a part of something with us, that they're on this Realm journey with us, and that somewhere, decades from now, we can look back and say that Realm contributed to the arc of Napa Valley wine growing in the way that all those mentors for me did in the past.
And I'm wondering, I think that's a great vision, by the way. And I'm wondering if what Realm is uncorking next is, I know you've opened up Realm North now, right, in Calistoga. And is that an ability to sort of open yourself up, to introduce yourself to more consumers? Is that part of what you're doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. And the irony is, part of it was we closed we closed to hospitality in 2018 because we had some construction going on, and then it was 2020 we lost the whole vintage, and it was COVID, and so we didn't really reopen for hospitality until end of 24, and then we opened this tasting room up in Calistoga. And we're about to actually transition and move that whole concept up to Hawaii because we believe in it so much. We've been able to engage with so many more people and try to do it in this way where it's like, back to your craft and culture thing, it's like, how do you take the wines very seriously, but not take ourselves too seriously? And so to create this environment where if you want to go geek out about the wines and go down the rabbit hole, we will go all the way down. Or if you just want to have a couple of glasses and a tasting and hang out with your friends, we can do that too. And so being able to be a little bit more accessible with the wines, we took the Bard is the wine that is our kind of calling card. It's a blend from Cabernet from all over the valley. 2023 was a generous vintage. We got a little more fruit there was just more fruit on the vine than anybody was expecting. And so we had a little bit more wine. And I said, you know what, if there's ever a moment for us to be able to talk about sharpening this sense of value, why not lower the price on this wine and give people a little bit of access?
Really smart.
And so again, I'm not saying no one, I might get eviscerated for saying 125 a bottle it's not cheap. And we'll never take that for granted. But for what we want it to be, and I think for what it represents, there is a sense of value there. So we want somebody who says, we think the Bard is among the greatest value wines in Napa Valley at the in the high end tier. We want it to punch above its weight, and by doing that, does it give us a little entree into maybe a consumer who just got a promotion at work or is celebrating a birthday and they're going to splurge, and for them that $125, that's their max. Maybe their max is 100, and they just go above.
Burgundy or Bordeaux, and hasn't so much tried California, and this is a gateway wine then for them into the high end of California. Another vineyard who I've interviewed who's doing a similar thing and trying to open themselves up more is Lafleur, and I found that very interesting.
Wow.
Right? Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. A mythical vineyard who says, it's time to really try to just be out there a little more. And I think it's so important for all of you in producing wines to be accessible as best as you can for customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, you realize we're in a battle for mind share.
Oh yeah.
And somebody gave me this line the other day. I thought it was great. It was like, who are your biggest competitors? And actually, I think this is true for the whole world of wine today. Our greatest competitor is not our neighbor or another brand. Our greatest competitor is non-consumption, or our greatest competitor is the person, I think about this a lot, who maybe orders one bottle of Realm, and for whatever reason, we didn't hit the mark for them, or we didn't engage them in the right way, or they don't feel connected and they don't come back. Or the person who signs up on our list and just doesn't engage, never buys. It's like, those are the people I lose sleep over, is like, how do I get them in? And so for all of us, I think, finding that way for connection, for accessibility, as you said, in the right way, the world of wine and the way people are engaging with it is changing. And so we've got to be able to adapt with it.
This has been great, Scott. Before we close, I have 3 last questions for you, if I may.
Fire away.
Thank you so much. First, please share an early wine memory, something that really drew you into wine.
So if you go back to my time in the military, I was kind of getting into wine, but didn't have context for the great wines of the world. And one of those stops back between the Middle East and the U.S. was at Aviano Air Base, and I had a couple of days off. So I rented a car, and it's a few hours drive to Piedmont. And so I checked myself into a little bed and breakfast in La Mora. I didn't then, and I don't now, speak a lick of Italian. I didn't have context for the great wines. I wasn't going in, let me find Giacosa Red Label. There was no no. I'm looking for Rwanda. No. So, but I go to this little restaurant, and I'm looking at the list, and by myself. I must have been, I don't know, early 20s at that point. I said to the gentleman who came over the table, I don't know if it was a sommelier, it was just the server. He says, can I help you with the wine? And I said, yeah, I'd like to drink something from here. And he says, here. And I said, yeah, here. And I'm thinking, does my English, maybe there's a translation thing. So he says, okay, no problem. He comes back, he brings me the bottle, or he brings me a glass, I guess it was, and drank it. And I said, oh, this is great. So, why'd you choose this? And he said, well, you said here. So he said, if you look out the window, you see that row. So this would be like, if I'm telling you this, I said, so Jeff, you want to drink something from here. So if you go, I'm going to pick a wine from that row, right? Wherever, that row right there and there. And what stuck with me more than the wine was this concept of here and place, clearly in Italian to somebody who was steeped in Barolo and Lamora culture. Here literally meant the vines right outside the window. And I was thinking the appellation, maybe the village of Lamora. I wasn't so specific, but it stuck with me because I think that's what we're trying to do today. Is I want somebody to go, Farella tastes entirely different than Hoyi. That's exactly the point.
Yeah.
So
that's great. What a great story. And it's similar to Rachel's. Hers was in, right, we talked about earlier, hers was in Germany when she was stationed in Germany, right? So so clearly the Army, this is a good way to help bring the next generation into wine.
Maybe we need a new marketing campaign with the U.S. military when they leave service, join the wine business.
Perfect. Please share one breakout moment at Realm where you knew you had really done something special.
Well, I think probably the most transformational moment. I don't know if it was done something special as much as it was we had created or that we now had a special opportunity, which would be, that first land purchase. When we bought this property in December 30th of 2015, that marked this change in when you're buying fruit and you're renting space, you're going from one year to the next. Maybe you got a multi-year grape contract, but
you're
that's
a renter, not a landowner.
Correct.
Or a household homeowner.
And as soon as we owned the land, I had to start thinking about decades. And maybe I'd been exposed to that a little bit just through Bill, because, Bill Harlan, was thinking about decades or famously maybe centuries. That might be a little too far out, but at least decades.
Stewardship. That's the stewardship from Bill's perspective at this point. And yours now.
Totally. Yeah. So I think that was the moment where it was like, okay, there is a responsibility here. Realm is now bigger than the people involved. And Bart Araujo gave me this line. I remember I was walking in the Isley Vineyard with him right after he sold it to Chateau Latour. And I said, Bart, any regrets? I was just curious about the whole thing. And he said, Scott, this land was here before us. This land will be here after us. And our job, Daphne and I's, our job was to be good stewards of it along the way. And that was such a profound moment for me of like, wow, that's how people think about land. And to his, and obviously Isley was a well-established name in Vineyard before Bart and Daphne, and it is again. And so I think that's your point of stewardship is, I got to feel like that opportunity emerged for us when we bought this first vineyard in end of 2015.
Yeah, I think that way about Zacky's, my business, right? Now, that we've sold the majority off and everything. And I felt like I was a steward of this business for many, many years and always had to do the right thing by it. Please share one piece of advice for someone who feels they don't belong in wine.
Well, I'd say then that's how you actually do. That's a very comfortable place to be, because that's where everybody in this business has been at one point or another.
Right. It's like you don't want to be in a club where they want you in the club, right?
At some point, even if you're second generation, fifth generation, what are the Antinori's on? I don't know, dozens of generations.
Yes, there are dozens.
Even with that sort of family lineage, at some point, the next generation inevitably ask themselves, am I good enough? Am I going to live up to the expectations of my parents? Can I do this? And so whether you came from that or you're more like me and you're just joining it because you're passionate about it, and everywhere in between, we've all had those moments of self-doubt and wondering where to go. The wine business is hard because there is no logical career. There is no like tried and true career path. You have to forge your own path in this business. And I think that's where mentorship and relationships become very important. But for those moments where you feel like you don't belong, that's how you know you actually do.
I love it.
I don't know.
That's brilliant.
Maybe it's
That's
helpful.
Really brilliant. No, very helpful. This has been a remarkable conversation. The Realm story is one of the great second act stories in American wines, built on resilience, honesty, and an almost stubborn belief in the land, right? And I encourage everybody out there, if you don't own any Realm, to go buy a bottle and open it. And if you have it, Realm in your cellar, and haven't opened it, don't wait till this weekend. Don't wait for a special occasion. Open it tonight, because you'll love what you have in the glass.
Thank you for that. And obviously, I'll say to all the viewers, come see us in Napa Valley.
Great.
Let's go walk a few vines, go taste a few barrels. I mean, there's nothing like seeing the place to really put it in perspective.
Yeah, beautiful. Scott, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jeff. Meaningful to be here. Thanks.
This podcast is sponsored by the Durant Corkscrew. If you enjoy mature wine as much as I do, you know how challenging older corks can be. Even with experience, they don't always cooperate. I still remember the first time I saw a Durant in use back in 2012. I was gobsmacked. It solved a problem I and every serious wine drinker has faced. It is as close to foolproof as I've ever found for opening bottles of wine with older corks, and now I keep 3 of them on hand. Here at Uncorking What's Next, we're giving a Durant away. Just share with me the story of what made you fall in love with wine. You can share it by email or Instagram. Over the summer, we'll be picking the best story to share on the podcast, and that person will win a Durant. And if you'd rather not wait, you can order the Durant directly at www.thedurant.com. Hi, listener. I'm looking to grow my show. And if you like this episode, I'd ask you to think of one person in your life who'd also really enjoy listening to it. And if so, would you please share it with them? I really appreciate you spreading the word and sharing. Let's find other people who are as excited about this as you are. I, Jeff Zacharia, am the producer of this show. I'm still connected with Zachy's Auctions as a consultant and auctioneer and helping to bring in consignments. But this podcast is not in any way connected with Zachy's. I also want to thank everyone who's made this podcast possible. I want to thank my daughter, Josephine Zacharia, my son and his wife, Tom and Alyssa Zacharia. All 3 are in the wine business, and I'm grateful for their thoughts and insights. My good friend, Christian Kuipers, for the artwork. My daughter by choice, Hannah Tobias, for the music. Soraya Perry, editor. Amelia Lankus, social media and marketing. My YPO Forum for the continued encouragement to step out of my comfort zone and make this podcast. And finally, for my amazing wife, Frederique, for her continued and constant support. Thank you.